Imagine walking into a small-town diner, expecting nothing more than a quick meal and a forgettable evening, only to witness a moment so powerful it leaves a billionaire CEO stunned into silence. No grand stage, no spotlight, no boardroom applause. Just a tired waitress, a nervous young man who couldn't speak a word aloud, and a language most people never bother to learn. What happened between them wasn't scripted, wasn't rehearsed, and yet it carried more impact than 1,000 motivational speeches. It was kindness taking shape right in front of him, the kind that doesn't need wealth, prestige, or recognition to matter. And in that flicker of authenticity, a story unfolded. One person reminding another of something we often forget in the rush of life, that connection begins with the courage to notice. The restaurant wasn't fancy, at least not from the outside. It was the kind of place where the paint on the sign had faded a little, and the neon open light flickered whenever the weather got humid. People stopped there because they'd heard the food was honest, the service kind, and the atmosphere unpretentious. Somehow that little corner diner had carved out a reputation not for extravagance but for sincerity. And for people like Rosa, sincerity was everything. Rosa had been working there for 6 years, 5 nights a week, juggling trays heavier than her arms seemed built for, memorizing every regular's drink and favorite meal. She wasn't the kind to make a fuss or crave recognition. She was the kind who found dignity in work, even if no one else noticed. People overlooked her constantly, the way people often overlook those they mistake for just waitstaff. But Rosa had a way of seeing others without needing to be seen herself, and that quietly had become her power. This particular Wednesday evening began like any other. The booths were half filled with commuters hungry after long shifts, a family passing through on their way back from a baseball game, and someone in the corner tapping away on a laptop, as though the world ended if they didn't answer every email before dessert. Rosa wiped the menus with deliberate precision, humming a little tune only she could hear, when the bell over the door jingled. In walked a man who at first glance looked completely ordinary. He wasn't dressed in a suit or accompanied by an entourage. No cameras clicked, no staff rushed to greet him. He wore jeans, a grey pullover, and the tired look of someone accustomed to being studied by everyone, but rarely acknowledged for himself. He was, unbeknownst to Rosa, and nearly everyone else in that diner, one of the most powerful CEOs in the country, a billionaire who had built an empire in technology, yet carried a low profile when stepping beyond conference stages and boardrooms. But tonight he wasn't walking in to be a CEO. He was just a customer, quiet and unassuming. He slid onto a stool at the counter, studying the menu like it actually mattered what he ordered, instead of being the kind of person who could buy everything printed on it. He was also, as Rosa would soon realize, not entirely at ease. Before Rosa could approach him, however, the bell rang again. This time the visitor was a young man, maybe in his early 20s, with a hoodie pulled over his head. He moved with hesitance. His eyes darted around, scanning, calculating whether he'd be welcomed in the space. When people greeted him from the counter, he didn't respond. When the server at the register asked, "Table for one," he made no sound. He pointed awkwardly toward the tables along the side wall. The hostess looked confused. Words stumbled in her throat. But before the awkwardness grew heavier, Rosa stepped forward with quiet calm. She had seen the man's gestures, the searching in his eyes, and recognized it not as rudeness but as silence born from necessity. She'd been teaching herself sign language for the past year after meeting a neighbor who was deaf, and she wanted to at least manage the basics. So Rosa walked over, placed the menus on the table, and, hands trembling slightly, signed a greeting. It wasn't flawless, but the man's face lit with astonishment. His nervous posture eased instantly, replaced by gratitude so plain it was almost radiant. He signed back slowly at first, and Rosa concentrated, working through the shapes of his language, nodding whenever she caught his meaning. It was simple: "Water, please." "Burger, no cheese." "Thank you." But in that simplicity was dignity. The CEO at the counter had paused mid-page of the menu. He had been watching, perhaps more closely than most. At first curiosity tugged him, how easily Rosa noticed what no one else did, how she bridged a gap that usually left people stranded. Then something else stirred, something harder to name. Because here he was, someone whose entire fortune rested on connecting the world. Yet the waitress in the corner diner was embodying connection in its purest form, without patterns or platforms, just patience and respect. As Rosa walked back to the kitchen with the order slip, the CEO's thoughts tangled. He remembered boardroom meetings where charts and numbers dictated customer engagement. He remembered press headlines applauding him for innovations. He remembered shaking hands with leaders who praised his work. Yet none of that felt anywhere near as authentic as what he had just witnessed between a waitress and a guest nobody else seemed prepared to acknowledge. This contrast grew sharper as the evening unfolded. The young man smiled nervously whenever Rosa returned, his shoulders easing as he used his own language without shame. Meanwhile, the rest of the room remained oblivious. How ironic, the CEO thought, that people sit inches away from a story significant enough to change them, yet never notice. When Rosa approached his stool to take his order, he studied her like a puzzle. She smiled, not the polished kind you saw in service training manuals, but the genuine kind that reached the eyes. "What'll it be tonight?" she asked brightly. He hesitated, then surprised himself by saying, "I'll have whatever you recommend." Her smile widened just a hint. She rattled off a suggestion, the house special home-style meatloaf with mashed potatoes, and he nodded, though he hardly registered the words. What occupied his mind was a single burning question. How often did moments like this go unseen? At that point, he wasn't thinking about money or technology. He was thinking about Rosa's instinct, and how instinct, when sharpened by empathy, made a person capable of changing someone else's entire evening. The food arrived, and conversation in the diner swirled as the clock pushed closer to closing time, but the CEO remained caught in his own reflection. People assumed billionaires exist in a constant loop of triumph, but in truth, loneliness often shadows them. Everyone wants something. Everyone greets with an angle. Yet here, sitting with humble food before him, he was reminded that connection doesn't require titles. It requires care. Rosa, meanwhile, carried on unfazed. She treated him no differently than the teenager balancing a homework notebook next to French fries, or the father bargaining with his kids over dessert. She floated between tables, efficient but warm. She didn't know she was being observed with the intrigue one might usually reserve for a scientific phenomenon or a revelation. And the deaf young man? He finished his meal, waving an exaggerated thanks to Rosa, his gratitude wordless yet entirely clear. Rosa signed back a modest goodbye, her fingers shaky but earnest, and he left with a smile that wasn't there when he walked in. The CEO watched everything. Something in his chest stirred, a combination of admiration and discomfort, because he knew this was no ordinary encounter. This was a mirror tilted his way. The diner grew quieter as the clock moved closer to closing hours. Coffee mugs clinked softly, and the low murmur of conversations became the soundtrack of a night winding down. The host dimmed the lights just slightly, signaling the transition into a slower rhythm. But at the counter, the billionaire CEO was anything but settled. He stirred his coffee more times than it needed stirring, his mind replaying what he had just witnessed as though his entire worldview had been challenged without warning. He tried to brush it off at first. People want to believe they control the moments that shake their lives, but often it's the small, unpredictable gestures that worm their way into the deepest cracks. Rosa wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wasn't angling for approval. She was simply doing what felt right. That was the most uncontrollable part of it all. Authentic kindness, unpolished and unscripted, disarmed him more than speeches delivered by powerful leaders ever had. The truth was, he often lived in rooms where every word mattered, where every action carried political meaning. In contrast, Rosa's action was stripped bare, one person recognizing another. Nothing to sell. Nothing to demand. Just grace spun into motion through a few hesitant fingers forming signs in the air. Pulling his wallet from his pocket, he thumbed through cash, then stopped. He almost laughed at himself. Normally, he tipped excessively when anonymity was safe. Money had become his easiest substitute for interaction. Yet tonight, a fat tip felt out of tune with what drove his admiration. Rosa hadn't acted for reward. A stack of bills would not honor what he'd seen. It would only flatten the depth of her gesture into a transaction. And that thought unsettled him further, because he realized just how much of his own world operated in pure transactions. He studied Rosa again as she hurried between booths, balancing glasses on her tray. Her shoes scuffed the tile floor, and strands of hair slipped out of her tied-back bun. She looked tired in the way people look tired when they work late shifts regularly, shoulders pulled tight, feet aching, yet still carrying herself like every guest mattered. She wasn't flawless or polished, but she radiated presence. The CEO suddenly felt a pang of something he rarely admitted: envy. Not envy of her financial situation. He could have bought the diner 10 times over without denting his bank account, but envy of her groundedness. She was firmly rooted in the soil of real relationships, while he floated in orbit around conference calls, quarterly reports, and investor expectations. He was lauded as brilliant, yet he watched this waitress and thought, "She knows something I've forgotten." He was still turning these thoughts when Rosa returned with his receipt. She set it down gently on the counter. "How's the meal?" she asked, brushing her hands on her apron lightly. The meatloaf was now only half eaten on the plate before him. To his embarrassment, he couldn't even answer honestly. His mind had been so distracted, he'd barely tasted it. "Good," he said quickly, though the word came out too flat. She gave a polite smile and began to turn when he stopped her. "Excuse me," he said, hesitating. "That young man earlier, the one you signed with, do you know him?" Her brows knit in mild confusion. "No, first time I've seen him. Why?" He struggled to put the weight of his question into words. "I just noticed how you treated him. Most people looked confused, but you handled it so naturally." She shrugged gently, almost apologetically. "Oh, it wasn't much. I'm still learning. My neighbor is deaf, and I thought it'd be nice to understand at least a little. He teaches me slowly." She chuckled softly. "I mess up the signs half the time, but it matters, you know. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong, even if all I can manage is a few words." Her casual explanation landed in the CEO's ears like a thunderclap dressed in modest clothing. Everyone deserves to feel like they belong. He rolled that line around in his head as though it were a riddle. In his world, belonging was manufactured through product ecosystems and corporate branding. Belonging was monetized. Here it was offered freely by a waitress in scuffed shoes, under flickering fluorescent lights. That's when he asked almost impulsively, "May I ask, why do you stay here? You clearly have more to give." Rosa blinked at him, thrown by the question. People rarely asked waitresses about their choices. "Why? Because it's work I can do well. Because it pays my bills. Because I have family to look after. And because," she trailed into a small smile, "I like people. Every day brings someone different through those doors. Sometimes it's exhausting, sometimes it's amusing, sometimes even beautiful. Like tonight." The CEO felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Moments like these carved deeper than speeches at global summits. He lowered his eyes, nodded slowly, and muttered, "That's remarkable." Rosa tilted her head, still confused by his intensity, but didn't press. Duty called her to the booth by the window, where a child was gleefully crushing crackers into a mountain. She excused herself, leaving him with the silence of his thoughts. And in that silence he began to feel something shift. He had built his career on the belief that technology could bridge divides, languages, distances, cultural barriers. Yet his astronaut's view of humanity, zoomed out so far, had wiped away individual faces. Rosa reminded him that real bridges are built at ground level, one moment at a time, unspectacular, but real. The CEO sat there long after paying his bill. Customers trickled out, dishes clattered in the kitchen, and chairs scraped as they were stacked on tables. Rosa worked with uncomplaining rhythm, already sweeping the floor after clocking out in her mind. He finally slid from his stool and paused at the door, torn between anonymity and revelation. Should he tell her who he was? Should he confess that her small act had unsettled a billionaire in the best way possible? He decided not yet. Something in him whispered, let this moment belong to her, untainted by the distortion of his identity. Tonight, let her kindness stand in its natural form, without it being dragged into headlines or distorted through the lens of wealth. He stepped into the night air, cool and damp, carrying the weight of a puzzle that refused to let go. For Rosa, it was just another shift, ending in aching feet and the small satisfaction of knowing she did her job with dignity. For the CEO, it was the night something fundamental cracked open inside him. He had come in hungry. He left with something far more pressing stirring in his soul, hunger for meaning. The city stretched before him as he walked back toward his hotel. Skyscrapers stood like silent judges, glowing windows mapping out entire lives he would never know. Usually John, yes, our anonymous diner visitor finally deserves a name, moved through cities like this with invisible armor. When you're a billionaire CEO, attention can be suffocating, so you learn to harden yourself, to dissolve into secrecy where you can. But tonight, John carried a strange vulnerability instead. His thoughts circled Rosa, the waitress who had unknowingly shone a spotlight on everything he lacked. He had sat in endless conference halls where leaders praised his innovations, had received awards framed in polished glass, but not once in recent memory had anyone made him feel small in the best way possible, seen for his humanity, not his empire. Witness. That role had belonged to Rosa without even knowing his name. Back at his penthouse suite, he found himself restless. The silence of carpeted luxury felt hollow compared to the chatter of the modest diner. He poured himself a glass of water, stared out the broad window, and wondered if all his success had dulled his capacity to notice. Rosa had noticed. That was her strength. And because she noticed, she had bridged a distance most people leave untraveled. The next morning should have been routine. His calendar buzzed with meetings. Investors at 10, leadership brief at noon, private jet waiting at 3. Yet John moved through it all with divided attention. Every conversation, every boardroom pitch echoed against the scene from the diner, a waitress fumbling but persistently signing words to a deaf stranger. It gnawed at him until he had to admit he wasn't simply inspired, he was challenged. One of the investors, catching his unfocused gaze, asked, "Everything all right, John?" "You seem distracted." He forced a smile. "Just thinking bigger picture. Bigger picture." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd said those words countless times to justify long-term bets. Yet for perhaps the first time, bigger picture meant looking closer, not further. Bigger picture meant remembering that behind every user profile or customer metric, there was an individual, someone just like that young man in the diner, or like Rosa, going unnoticed until someone truly saw them. By evening, his restlessness drove him back toward the diner. Call it impulsive or maybe fate, but he wasn't finished with the lesson Rosa had unknowingly begun teaching. He slipped into a corner booth, hood pulled low, scanning for her. She was there. Same scuffed shoes, same tired shoulders, same focused kindness. And again, like clockwork, people barely noticed her. John ordered coffee. Rosa recognized him and gave a polite smile. "Back again?" she asked. "Yes," he replied simply. "Good coffee." She chuckled. "That's the first time I've heard anyone call it that." Their small talk ended when another family bustled in, followed soon after by a couple who debated loudly over appetizers. Rosa disappeared into the rhythm of her work, and John sat quietly observing again. He was no longer studying Rosa with curiosity, but with intent. If kindness like hers could ripple in such a small environment, what would happen if it were amplified? Could the lens of humanity be expanded without breaking under the weight of technology? Could he, ironically the man who answered grand questions with algorithms, finally learn to answer it with something simpler? Human gestures. The thought matured into an idea, then slowly into resolve. He decided he wanted to speak to her properly before he left town. Not just to thank her, but to listen. Rosa had unknowingly poked a hole through his carefully inflated world. He needed to know how she saw things. When she later returned with his refill, he leaned in a little. "May I ask you a strange question?" Her brow lifted. "Depends how strange." He laughed softly. "What keeps you hopeful?" It wasn't the kind of question customers usually asked servers between soda refills. She blinked, taken aback. But as was her way, she didn't dismiss him. She tilted her head and thought carefully. "Hopeful," she repeated slowly. "I guess people keep me hopeful. For every rude customer, there's someone who surprises me. And I see it when people look out for each other. Like that young man last night. I could tell when he left that he felt lighter. That's enough for me most days. It's not big or dramatic, but it's enough." Her answer landed with force, though she delivered it as though she'd said nothing profound. John nearly smiled. He knew CEOs who would have paid consultants millions to capture insights packaged less beautifully than this. Yet Rosa gave it away freely while pouring coffee into a chipped mug. Something inside him began piecing itself together. He had been chasing scale all his life. More users, more devices, more markets. But scale without sincerity felt hollow. Rosa had no scale, no power, no platform. Yet her impact, one interaction at a time, was undeniable. The contrast sharpened, and John decided right there that this wasn't a story to keep hidden inside himself. It had to grow. Of course, he didn't rush. Rosa was too real, too unperformed, to be thrust suddenly into a spotlight she neither wanted nor probably welcomed. He finished his coffee quietly, left another discreet payment, and stepped out. Later, back at his suite, he opened his laptop, but not for a spreadsheet or market strategy. He began to write. Not an executive memo, not a press release, a reflection. Pages turned into pages, as though every suppressed thought about meaning and connection came pouring out. And before he realized it, Rosa's quiet act had become the seed of something, an idea for a foundation focused not on flashy tech, but on amplifying humanity. Teaching workers like Rosa, elevating small kindness into narratives larger than boardroom victories, yet for all his grand planning, a nagging voice followed him. She doesn't even know who you are. That voice grew with each day that passed until finally, John conceded. He would have to tell her. He couldn't carry on building from her example while keeping his identity hidden, as though he were siphoning off some secret inspiration. Rosa deserved to know what influence she had sparked. So a week later, after maneuvering his schedule, he returned to the diner again, this time not to hide, but to reveal. He rehearsed mentally but discarded it all. He knew authenticity was the only approach Rosa would recognize. When she appeared tableside that evening, her demeanor unchanged, he drew a breath. "Rosa, I need to tell you something. My name is John Mercer." She froze slightly, the name clicking in her mind. Even working long hours, she had caught television headlines or news scrolling by. Wide-eyed, she stammered, "Wait, you mean like the CEO?" John nodded with a humility foreign to his usual introductions. "Yes, but I need you to understand. It's not the billionaire you impressed that night. It was just me, a man who walked into a diner and discovered something he'd forgotten. That connection doesn't need a platform. It needs care. And you reminded me what that looks like." Silence ballooned. Rosa blinked, trying to process this collision of two worlds, her modest diner shift and a corporate giant confessing she had inspired him. "What am I supposed to say to that?" She whispered finally. "Nothing," John said. "Just keep being who you are, because the world notices more than you think." Rosa stood still, tray in hand, staring at the man who had just reintroduced himself, not as a mystery diner, but as someone whose name carried weight far beyond the walls of her little corner restaurant. A billionaire CEO sitting in her section, telling her that her simple humanity had inspired him. It didn't compute. She gave a nervous laugh, the kind people give when words won't form properly. "You're serious? You're actually—" "Him?" John nodded with the kind of small, weary smile that betrayed how tired he was of that question. "I am. But tonight, to me, I'm just the guy who came back here because I needed to say thank you." Rosa blinked several times, gathering herself. In the sea of orders waiting to be called out, and coffee cups begging for refills, the room suddenly shrank. One table, one conversation, one piece of truth dangling between them. So she did what she always did when life felt bigger than her comprehension. She grounded herself. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and asked softly, "Why me?" John exhaled, the heavy kind. "Because you reminded me what connection means. I spend my life surrounded by people who want things, from me, from my company, from the idea of success. But you noticed someone no one else noticed, and you acted, not because of recognition, but because that's who you are." I forgot what that looked like. "You reminded me." Still overwhelmed, Rosa tried to deflect with humor. "You sure it wasn't just the meatloaf that moved you?" John chuckled, which broke the tension just enough. "I'll grant you the meatloaf was part of the experience. But no, it was you." Somewhere in the corner booth, a toddler shrieked with delight at a paper straw wrapper. Life moved on around them, unfazed by revelations. And maybe that was fitting. For Rosa, however, the revelation threatened to tilt her balance. She had customers to serve, tables to clean, yet a man who controlled billions of dollars was essentially saying she had reshaped his worldview. Seeing her unease, John leaned back. "I know this is overwhelming, and I didn't come here to unsettle you. I only came to thank you. And maybe to say that sometimes the biggest changes in people start small, in diners, not boardrooms." His words settled like quiet waves. Rosa both wanted to laugh and cry. She had thought so little of her fumbling attempts at sign language, yet here was validation beyond what she could grasp. She finally let out a long sigh. I'm just doing my job." John looked at her very directly, his eyes rare heavy with sincerity. "No, you're doing more. Jobs tell us to deliver. Humanity tells us to connect. You do both." Something in Rosa softened at that. The shock gave way to a kind of clarity. Maybe life didn't measure impact by scale, money, or headlines. Maybe it measured impact one person at a time, one gentle decision after another. By the time her shift ended, John had already slipped away. He'd left a handwritten note on the back of his receipt. It was short, 2 sentences, but packed with weight. "The world runs on people like you, Rosa. Never doubt how noticed you are." No signature. No mention of money. Just ink on paper. She folded it into her apron pocket and pressed it against her palm like a hidden treasure. For John, leaving the diner that night wasn't the end, but a beginning. The seed that had sprouted inside him was now growing into something tangible. His company already employed tens of thousands, already spanned global markets. But he realized what it lacked was intentional programs that celebrated grassroots kindness, the unsung actions that anchored societies. Over the next months, he began shaping a new branch of his philanthropic work, not the flashy kind designed to secure headlines or political favor, but one built quietly, almost stubbornly, on the model Rosa had given him, noticing overlooked stories. He invested in scholarships for students who wanted to learn sign language and accessibility programs that bridged gaps for deaf individuals in public spaces. He launched recognition initiatives for invisible heroes in everyday jobs: waitresses, bus drivers, janitors, people whose oceans of patience and small kindness formed unseen foundations for society. Journalists noticed eventually. The headlines rolled in. Tech titan turns focus toward everyday heroes. But while publicists crafted narratives, John carried an image that mattered more than all of them. Rosa, slipping menus onto a table, smiling nervously, yet signing slowly to a young man who had feared being out of place. That was the snapshot he carried into every boardroom conversation. Meanwhile, in her world, Rosa's life remained mostly unchanged. She still worked long shifts. She still chased tired children away from dangerously stacked pie trays. She still had bills that never seemed to shrink. What had shifted was internal. Somewhere deep down, she knew her actions had rippled farther than she could see, and that knowledge gave her a sturdier sense of dignity. She taught herself more sign language with a renewed determination. She paid even closer attention to the small details of people passing through her section. Every interaction felt infused with possibility, as though at any moment, kindness might ripple further than she imagined. Months later, John returned a final time unannounced, slipping into the diner's corner booth once again. This time he didn't hide behind a hood or anonymity. When Rosa spotted him, recognition sparked in her smile. "You're back," she said, approaching with the easy tone of familiarity rather than awe. "I'm back," he confirmed. "And I'm still grateful." They spoke only briefly, she was still working after all, but in their exchange something balanced out. He was no longer the stunned billionaire, and she no longer the waitress startled by revelation. They were simply two people who had witnessed one another clearly, and that was enough. The lesson stretched far beyond them. The spaces where true impact occurs aren't reserved for palaces or trading floors. Sometimes they exist in flickering diners, where the most powerful act isn't a deal signed, but a hand raised in a language half-learned but wholly heartfelt. John left that night with no note and no drama. Rosa finished her shift, dropped her apron and headed home to family. Two lives had touched across an improbable divide, and the echo of that contact lingered, quiet, steady, and transformative. Perfect. Let's land this story with a powerful outro. This final section will be exactly 500 words, bringing us to the grand total of 4,500 words is. I'll close with a natural story beat that ties everything together. Then shift into the kind of direct and engaging outro language that would cue listeners to subscribe, without breaking the storytelling immersion. Months passed, and life carried on much the way it always had. Rosa still arrived at the diner at the same hour, still slipped into her uniform, still gave that quiet smile that was now becoming her signature. On the surface, nothing massive had changed, but beneath the surface, everything had. She knew that what she did mattered. She knew that when she spoke kindness into the world, whether through a clumsy sign, a gentle word, or simply her presence, she was part of something that echoed bigger than she realized. Across the city, John's work unfolded in ways that others celebrated loudly in the press, but for him it remained deeply personal. Every time a young deaf student received a grant for their education, he thought of Rosa. Every time his company rolled out small but meaningful accessibility tools, he thought of that diner table where courage and humility had quietly intersected. And when commendations came his way, he smiled politely, but in his heart, he credited the waitress who refused to let another human feel invisible. It's funny how stories like this ripple in opposite directions. To Rosa's family, she was simply who she always had been, maybe smiling a little more often, maybe holding her head a little higher. To John's board of directors, he appeared as visionary as ever, although his strategies now tilted slightly toward what others had overlooked. Neither group knew the entire truth of how their lives shifted that night under fluorescent lights. But that's what makes these kinds of encounters powerful. Transformation doesn't need to be declared. It simply flows outward a bit at a time, shaping futures silently. And that's what we take away. The small deliberate act of seeing someone, really seeing them, beyond surface discomfort or difference, changes the story. Rosa would never have described herself as extraordinary, but she demonstrated what extraordinary really means. It isn't about titles, money, or being recognized in headlines. It's about bridging the quiet distances most people step around. For John, the encounter became a mirror, reflecting back what he had lost while chasing the abstract idea of connection at enormous scale. For Rosa, it was a reminder that her humanity had weight in the world. For the young man who entered the diner that night, weary of being misunderstood, it was a point of belonging he carried with him. And for us, the ones hearing about it, it is proof that kindness, when unnoticed, is never wasted. It just waits for the right moment to be remembered, sometimes by the most unlikely person. So what does this mean for you? It means that every small gesture has the potential to ripple into places you cannot fathom. You may never know that someone left lighter because of a word you offered. You may never realize the invisible CEO watching you, the stranger whose life bends because, for one moment, you acted with compassion. But the truth remains, such acts matter. The world notices. And if you want to continue uncovering more stories like this, where ordinary people shape extraordinary ripples, make sure you stay with us. Hit that subscribe button, join this community, and keep the chain of kindness alive by sharing these lessons forward. After all, the most powerful stories aren't the ones that end. They're the ones retold, shaping each next act of courage, each next act of care. Because who knows? The next story might be inspired by you.